Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to the Erickson Report. I'm Larry Erickson, and I'm your host, and for the next pretty much half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things I hope you'll find interesting, one thing in particular. If you have any comments, questions, or reactions to the show, by all means, you can send them to me directly. This is my personal email, whoviating, WHOVIATING, at AOL.com. And if you didn't catch that, you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. And the URL should be up a couple of times. You can get the email address from there, or if you'd rather, you can leave a comment there. If you do send me email, I have just two requests. One, please include something in the subject line to make it clear this is about the show, it's not spam. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I stink at answering email. So with that, let's get to it. This show is going to be on from just before to the couple of weeks after Thanksgiving. So it seemed to me the right time to engage in this sort of thing I do pretty much every year when I say, gather around kiddies, I'm going to tell you the real story, the based on historical accounts story of the first Thanksgiving. And by that, of course, I mean the event that took place in the fall of 1621 in what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts, which became the basis for our now traditional Thanksgiving holiday. One of the reasons I do this pretty much every year is because it's astonishing how much misinformation, mythology, and general muddle-headedness there is about this event on the topic. In fact, it seems that what could fairly be called revisionist history has become almost as traditional as turkey and pumpkin pie. I like to bring some historical reality to the discussion. So, to start our Thanksgiving tale, consider this. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help aside, served the company almost a week. At which time, among other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest King Massasoit with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And though it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. That comes a letter dated December 11, 1621. It was written to an otherwise identified loving and old friend in England by, it's believed, Edward Winslow, a Mayflower passenger and a leader in the early years of the colony. This portrait of Winslow, by the way, was done in 1651, 30 years later and after he'd returned to England. Its real significance is that it is the only known portrait of a Mayflower passenger that is known to exist. As for the rest of them, we have no idea what they look like, except for the traditional description of Miles Standish as short with red hair. That's a description given some backing by the fact that in a book called The New English Canaan, which was a nasty satire of the Plymouth settlement written in 1637 by a man named Thomas Morton, Standish is identified by the name Captain Shrimp. Now, Winslows Letter, getting back to that, was contained in a book published in England in 1622 under the rather ponderous title of A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plantations Settled at Plymouth in New England by certain English adventurers, both merchants and others. The book is popularly known today by the rather less cumbersome title of Mort's Relation, and it consists of eyewitness accounts of events during the first year of the settlement. Now, why is that letter, that Winslow Letter, why is that so important? It is the only contemporaneous account of what we now know as the first Thanksgiving known to exist. The only other even near contemporaneous account comes from William Bradford, longtime governor of the colony, who wrote about it in his journal at least 10 or 12 years later. Even they were just sort of brushes by it, endorses Winslow by referring to not feigned but true reports. This is what he says. They now begin to gather in the small harvest they had and to fit up their houses against the winter, being all well recovered in health and strength and had all things in good plenty. For some were thus involved in affairs abroad. Others are exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took in good store, of which every family had its portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterwards decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so large of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned, but true reports. Okay, that's it. That's all of it. That's what the entire first Thanksgiving story is based on. Everything else is at least some questionable second and third hand accounts, but speculation, interpretation, and guesswork. Some of it informed, all too much of it not. Now, there are some things we can tell from the accounts. For one thing, based on other references in those same sources, that is Winslow and Bradford, we know that the event took place after September 18th and before November 9th. Most likely it was late September or early October, as that would have been shortly after harvest. In considering the event, the first thing that we need to realize is that this was not a Thanksgiving as we understand the term. To someone of the period, a Thanksgiving was a religious occasion set aside to give thanks to God for some special and unexpected blessing. The first day of public Thanksgiving in the town, in fact, came in 1623. In the summer, in July it was, in fact, a crop-threatening drought threatened the crops, and that led to a day of humiliation, which is a day of fasting and prayer to ask God's forgiveness for whatever it is they had done, for God to call such a thing down on them. And later that same day of humiliation, there came a gentle soaking rain which saved the crops. And so a day of Thanksgiving was thought to be appropriate. So no, this was not a Thanksgiving. Such days would occur occasionally as the cause arose. To plan for one in advance, especially to plan for one every year as we do now, would be regarded as a gross presumption on God's will and God's intentions. What this was instead was a very traditional English harvest feast, a celebration of a good harvest to which it was customary to invite those who had been helpful to you in your fields over the course of the year, which is likely why the natives were there. They had been helpful, so they were invited. Now, true, the settlers didn't have a good harvest. No, Bradford calls it small, but they had a harvest. That surely raised everyone's spirits and indicated that, in fact, that they were going to make it, which was reason enough for a celebration, especially considering what they'd been through to get that far. Now, I want to make a quick aside to explain a rather subtle point more clearly. For Europeans of the 17th century, especially the more religiously conservative sorts, such as those who were the leaders of the Plymouth settlement, those people did not make the clear distinctions that we make between what's religious and what's secular. The sense of, a feeling of, an awareness of the hand of God or the will of God in everything was much more central to their lives than it is to the vast majority of us now. What that means here is that the 1621 harvest would surely have included enough prayers of thanks to God, perhaps a sermon from their religious leader, Elder William Brewster. These would have been significant features of the event, just as prayer would have been a frequent feature of their lives, from meals to musket drills to mucking in their fields. However, they would not have regarded this as a day of thanksgiving as they understood the term. While prayers would have been an essential feature of the event, they would not have been the purpose of the event, not the point of the event. Celebration was the point. Feasting was the point. Put another way, had we been able to witness the 1621 feast with our modern eyes, there would have been very likely more than enough praying, giving thanks, singing of psalms and hymns to make it look like a religious or at least religiously inspired event. But to a person of the 17th century, it would have looked about as secular as such a thing got. Anyway, back to our story. As for the eternal question of what they ate, We can be confident they had fowl, such as duck or goose. Note that the governor sent 4 men on fowling and preparation. And yes, quite possibly turkey, of which they took many, Bradford said, along with fish, specifically cod and bass, which Bradford also mentions, and quite possibly deer. Now, the reason I say quite possibly is to raise the issue of using historical sources without running too far ahead of them, which is a sin of which the revisionist accounts are often guilty. Even though Winslow says the natives went out and killed 5 deer, he also says, which they bestowed on our governor, that being William Bradford, and upon the captain, that being Miles Standish, and others. In other words, they were given to various leaders of the community, not to the community as a whole. And even more to the point, we can't tell if those deer were brought soon enough to be butchered, dressed, and presented as part of the feast, or they were brought later as a sort of reciprocal gift, a thank you for having been entertained and feasted for 3 days. Bradford's mention of venison doesn't actually resolve things, because in the period, venison meant hunted meat, not just deer. So while they quite probably had deer, either from the natives or their own hunting or both, we can't say it definitively. All right, getting back to the menu. Lobster and shellfish are another real possibility. Elsewhere in the letter that I quoted, Winslow says they are plentiful in the area, as are eels, of which they could take a hogshead in a night, he said. Now, if you think eels, ew, just realize that an English person of the period would have said they're just another sort of fish. And a hogshead, by the way, is a large cask that holds 63 gallons of liquid, which means Linda was probably exaggerating, and he was like that. Beyond that, we can reasonably argue for some other foods, such as a pie made from squash from their gardens, sweetened with dried fruit brought from England, salad from other stuff in their gardens, and a sort of coarse cornbread. Water would have been the major and perhaps the only beverage. Their supply of barley would be limited, as Winslow says that the English grains, which would mean such as wheat, rye, and oats, as well as barley, he says they grew indifferent good. And there's no mention of hops. No hops, no beer, not much barley, not much ale. Even if they did have some barley, there may not have been enough time to brew before the feast. And while they did bring beer with them on the voyage, there's really no reason to think there was any significant amount of that left nearly a year later. So they might have had a little ale or maybe even a little wine that was brought from England and saved for a special occasion. But again, it was most likely, maybe even completely, water. So that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything we know or can reasonably assume about the event, which is not much to build whole mythology on, is it? Even so, it drove the pap we got fed as school children, marked by images of picnic tables laden down with turkey, mashed potato, and apple pies, surrounded by natives dressed like they just came for the Great Plains, and smiling pilgrims dressed in fashions of the 1690s. And that same sparseness of detail, and it's one of the reasons I go through this every year, or almost every year, that same sparseness of detail is probably a good part of the reason that the event provides so much latitude to those who want to replace that childhood and childish image of noble settlers and savage natives with one of savage settlers and noble natives, who every year, regular as clockwork, want to treat us to the historical revisionism, which again has become as traditional as turkey and cranberry sauce. In place of the happy talk mythologies of peace, love, and harmony we're spoon-fed as children, we find people snarling out dark tales of drunken, murderous, bloodthirsty settlers facing off with natives crashing the party at Thanksgiving, and doing it in such numbers because Massasoit feared he'd be kidnapped or killed otherwise. It's a vision that, as much as the earlier one, tries to overwrite history with ideology. It is, in other words, pure bunk. In point of historical fact, relations between the settlers of Plymouth and their nearest native neighbors were reasonably good for several decades. There were stresses and strains and disruptions, yes, but for the most part, they managed to keep intact the peace agreement, mutual defense pact that they made in the spring of 1621. Things gradually got worse, and I won't go into all the reasons why, but the biggest two were population pressure, which actually arose mostly out of Boston, which was established in 1630, and disputes over land that were rooted in vast cultural differences between the settlers and the natives. Specifically, the native culture had no concept of land ownership. Not just they didn't own the land, or everybody owned the land, or the Great Spirit owned the land. No, the idea of land as something that could be possessed, something that could be owned, just didn't exist. To the natives, to own something meant you could pick it up and take it away with you. How could you own something that you have to leave behind anytime you go anywhere? Which made real sense, especially for a semi-nomadic people who lived in one area part of the year and another area the rest of the year. But for the settlers, for any European, the use of land ownership, which by its nature involves the notion of exclusive use, was an everyday concept. That cultural chasm caused any number of conflicts. Now that peace finally irrevocably, completely broke down, but that was in 1675, more than 50 years after the first Thanksgiving. The important point here is that at that time, in the fall of 1621, native-settler relations were good. In fact, the very next sentences of that Winslow letter I quoted above, the very next sentences are these. We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them. Winslow also says that other native leaders in the vicinity have made peace with Plymouth on the same terms that Massasoit did, as a result of which, he asserts, there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly. He then goes on to say that we, for our parts, walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways of England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us. They are a people without any religion or knowledge of God, yet very trusty, quick of apprehension, ripe-witted, just. And just to be certain you know, so you're clear on this, trusty here means trustworthy, it doesn't mean trusting. Quick of apprehension does not mean quick to be apprehensive. It means quick to understand. It means quick to grasp the meaning of something. As for religion, in his later book, Good News for New England, published in England in 1624, Winslow says, therein I erred, and goes on to describe the native religion, at least as he understands it. Now, that description in that letter does not sound either like bloodthirsty settlers eager to kill natives, or natives who feared contact with those same settlers or felt they had to display massive force in order to not be kidnapped or killed. If you're still not convinced, consider that in June of 1621, 3 or 4 months before the feast, the town felt it necessary to send a message to Massasoit requesting that he restrain his people from coming to the settlement in such numbers. This is from Mort's relation. This is part of the message they sent to Massasoit. But whereas his people came very often and very many together unto us, bringing for the most part their wives and children, they were welcome. Yet we, being but strangers as yet at Pawtuxet, alias New Plymouth, and not knowing how our corn might prosper, we could no longer give them such entertainment as we had done and as desired still to do. That's how afraid the natives were of the settlers. So afraid that the settlement ultimately had to ask Massasoit to please keep them from coming in such numbers. That's how afraid the natives were of the settlers. Assigning the role of angel or demon to either of these peoples is bogus. It's trash. Neither were either. Neither were saints, neither were devils. So I reject the revisionist history. Indeed, I resent the revisionist history. I resent it first because it's lousy history. It's based on ideology, not information. It looks to satisfy the demands of politics, not of scholarship, and it is every bit full of false tales and mythology as the nonsense and pap we got fed as school children. Plymouth in the fall of 1621 generally was a scene of peaceful and friendly relations, of good feeling between English settlers, and their nearest native neighbors. The first Thanksgiving was a moment of celebration when everyone on both sides, even if they were maybe still a little wary of each other, but everyone on both sides was thinking, yeah, we can work this out. This is going to be okay. Now, that wasn't going to happen. It was a false hope, even a foolish hope. It was a brief enough moment, lasting even by a generous definition, no more than a couple of decades, and a rare enough moment in our nation's history of cruelty toward and genocide of the native peoples of this continent, such that while the first Thanksgiving shouldn't be a source of happily ever after, why can't we all get along fairy tales, neither is there a need to co-opt it into the service of ideologically driven revisionism. Because that moment of hope did exist. And frankly, I resent the attempts to strip away that moment of hope in pursuit of a modern political agenda. I remember a friend of mine some years ago talking about the urge to find angelic forces in the world. That is, the seeming need many of us have to fix on some group, some movement, something that we can assure ourselves is utterly pure in its motives and its desires. In our attempts to find some better balance in our understanding of what was done to the native peoples of North America, the cruelties inflicted on them, the racism and bigotry which targeted them, too many of us, in considering the so-called pilgrims of Plymouth, have chosen to swap one mythology for a perhaps more satisfying but equally false one. Balance, it seems, is still a long way off. All right, I'm going to round out this with a couple of sidebars, a few details that you might find interesting about that first year. You often hear, for example, the Mayflower referred to as a small ship. To our eyes, it is, but at 180 ton, it was somewhat larger than an average merchant ship of the period, which ran about 140 to 160 ton. A ton, by the way, is a large cask that became used as a standard measure of the capacity of a ship's hold. You'll also often hear it said that the passengers came for religious freedom. They did not. Not only did they not believe in religious freedom as we understand the term, freedom being equated with anarchy, to the degree that they wanted what they would call liberty of conscience for themselves. Those who had been to Holland, which actually was a minority of those on the Mayflower, but those who had been to Holland found that liberty there. Unfortunately, in fact, that's actually why they went to Holland in the first place. Now, but unfortunately for them, they not only found such liberty, they also found poverty of a degree severe enough that it threatened to fracture their little community. That's why they left Holland. That's why they came here. It's also been asserted that the first winter was marked by starvation. I've even heard it claimed that they all would have starved to death but for the corn they stole from a native cache while they were exploring Cape Cod. Again, it's not true, or it's half true in this case. The deaths came from disease, likely pneumonia, spread by the necessity of living in close quarters. They had to live on the ship or in very close quarters. Still enough housing can be built for people to start spread out. So that made it very easy for disease to spread across the entire community. The ship's stores provided plenty of food and supplies to fill their bellies over the course of the winter. Now, it is true that they stole corn while exploring on Cape Cod, but that was seed corn for the following spring. And in fairness, it has to be noted that they made good for what they took when they were able to make contact with those natives the following spring. Finally, for this moment, they were not greeted by the indigenous people. In fact, they didn't speak to a native till March. And that was to Samoset and Abenaki from what's now Maine. It wasn't until a couple of weeks after that that they spoke to a local native, which was Squanto or Tisquantum. Okay, so anyway, I hope you enjoyed your Turkey Day. I hope you got to spend time with your family or friends, or better yet, both. And I hope you can understand why I celebrate the day less as an expression of thankfulness for the present or even the past than as an expression of hope for the future. That hope may prove ultimately to be as foolish as that hope of 1621, and I often think it is. But the blunt fact is, hope is the one absolute, indispensable requirement for any effort to make that world a better one. And I need a break. Okay, I have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to end with a couple of things that would have been in the show and gotten more attention if we were not doing our special Thanksgiving show. First up, on November 21st, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as long predicted and recently expected, was indicted on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He faces the possibility of more than 10 years in prison. And to show how some things are truly transnational among the right wing, he called the charges a witch hunt and a political coup and called for an investigation of the investigators. This comes as Benny Gantz failed to form a ruling majority in the parliament, meaning the nation is now facing its third parliamentary elections in less than a year. It also comes just days after the Treaty Pie administration announced it was reversing 41 years of U.S. foreign policy, now declaring that Israeli settlements in the occupied territories are not inconsistent with international law, even though they clearly are and remain so in the eyes of much of the world, including the European Union. This is the latest in a string of extreme right-wing Christian fundamentalist moves by the administration, including moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, closing the Palestinian mission in Washington, D.C., and halting congressionally appropriated aid to the West Bank and Gaza. All right, next up, Bloomberg News reported on November 22nd that a database aggregating 1.2 billion users' personal information, including social media accounts related to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and GitHub, with associated email addresses and phone numbers, were discovered unprotected on a Google Cloud server last month. So far, no one knows for certain how that information got there, including whether this was data being compromised or just plain stupidity. In either case, remember, your privacy is their primary concern. All right, this is something I don't have time for. Hopefully, it's going to be a subject of a deeper look, or a longer look, rather, in a show or two. But I need to say this now. When Bolivian President Evo Morales left office on November 10th, he did not resign. He did not step down. He was forced out in a military coup, one which is recognized as such by the governments, among others, the governments of Mexico and Uruguay, the president-elect of Argentina, British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, the former OAS Secretary General Miguel Insulza, and U.S. presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. It's a military coup, in fact, which daily is becoming more repressive and more violent. Although the fact is, if you relied on the U.S. mainstream media, you think this whole thing was a blossoming of democracy equivalent to overthrowing Hitler himself. As the media watchdog organization FAIR put it, when is a coup not a coup? When the U.S. government is glad it happened. All right, we're going to end on a happy note here. Dr. Scott Warren of the immigrant group No More Deaths was facing 10 years in prison on a charge of harboring unauthorized immigrants for the heinous act of providing food, water, and a place to sleep overnight for some immigrants who were making the risky and sometimes deadly trek across the Sonoran Desert. After a 6-day trial on November 20th, it took the jury just 2 hours to acquit him. Take that, Border Patrol. All right, that's it. That's enough for now. We are going to see you in a couple of weeks. I expect then I'll have my special holiday show. The 2 burning questions. Why is Christmas on December 25th as opposed to any other day of the year? Why is New Year's Day January 1st as opposed to any other day of the year? Questions I'm sure you ponder intently every holiday season, so I'll be here to answer it for you. That's it for now. We will see you in a couple of weeks. But for the moment, as always, peace.